Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive into one of the most legendary cities of all time. The name Troy. It's super famous, right? But what makes it so legendary? It makes you think of heroes and gods, big love stories, and a war that changed everything. The tales of Troy are filled with larger-than-life characters and epic battles that have inspired countless works of art and literature. This isn't just any story. It's a saga that has been passed down through generations, capturing the imagination of people for millennia. It's like a really old story that everyone knows a little bit about. Whether it's from school, movies, or books, the story of Troy has a way of sticking with you. Troy, it was this city, kind of mysterious, and people have been fascinated by it for like thousands of years. Its ruins still stand today, whispering secrets of a bygone era. The really famous stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they take us back to this lost city. These epic poems by Homer are some of the oldest and most important works of Western literature. They tell us about a city under attack, warriors fighting, and a big wooden horse that, well, let's just say it wasn't a gift. The Trojan horse is one of the most iconic symbols of cunning and strategy in history. For a long time, people thought Troy was just made up, like a fairy tale. It was a place of myth and legend, not something you could actually visit. But guess what? Under all those stories, there was a real city, a real place with history and culture, just waiting to be found. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of ruins that tell the story of a city that was once vibrant and bustling. This place, it's in Turkey now, and it proves these stories really meant something. The site of ancient Troy is located in the northwest of modern-day Turkey, near the Dardanelles. It's where the stories and real history come together, where you can almost hear the past talking to us today. Walking through the ruins, you can almost feel the presence of the ancient Trojans. And Troy wasn't just about the war. It was a thriving city with a rich culture and economy. It was a busy city, a place where people from all over came together to trade stuff. Merchants from different regions would gather here, making it a melting pot of cultures and ideas. It was right between the East and West, so it was super important. This strategic location made Troy a key player in ancient trade networks, connecting different parts of the world. Today, visitors from around the world come to explore its ruins and learn about its incredible history. Museums and interactive exhibits bring the story of Troy to life, making it accessible to people of all ages. So the next time you hear about the legend of Troy, remember that it's more than just a story. It's a window into a world that once was, a place where myth and history intertwine. This place where Troy was, it's like a giant history sandwich. Imagine peeling back the layers of an onion, but instead of finding more onion, you find different eras of human civilization stacked on top of each other. There are layers and layers of stuff, one on top of the other, from different times. Each layer represents a different period in history, with its own unique artifacts, structures, and stories waiting to be discovered. It's not like other old cities where they just built on the same spot. In Troy, each new civilization built directly on top of the ruins of the previous one, creating a vertical timeline of human history. Troy is built up like a layer cake. Each layer is like a chapter in a book, telling the story of the people who lived there, their triumphs, their struggles, and their everyday lives. Each layer shows a different time, from Troy 1 all the way to Troy 9th. These layers are like pages in a history book, each one adding more detail to the story of this ancient city. These layers go back thousands of years and show how the city changed. From a small settlement to a bustling metropolis, each layer reveals how Troy evolved over time. It's like peeling back time, one layer at a time, and each layer tells a new part of the story. The deeper you go, the further back in time you travel, uncovering secrets that have been buried for millennia. The very oldest layers, from way, way back, show a small town, but it was still busy. Even in its earliest days, Troy was a hub of activity, with people trading, building, and living their lives. As time went on, the city got bigger and more important, and the walls grew to protect everyone. These walls weren't just for defense. They were a symbol of the city's strength and prosperity. Because it was so important, lots of people wanted to control Troy. So sometimes things were good, and sometimes things were, well, not so good. The city saw periods of peace and prosperity, but also times of conflict and destruction. The most famous layer is Troy Sever. That's the one from the Trojan War. This layer is particularly fascinating because it ties the archaeological evidence to the legendary tales of Homer. There, they found signs of fire, destruction, and then rebuilding, which shows there was a lot of fighting. The evidence of conflict in this layer supports the stories of a great war that took place here. The Trojan War, the one from the stories, might be a mix of made-up stuff and real stuff, but we know for sure Troy was in a bunch of fights back then. The blend of myth and reality makes Troy a captivating subject for historians and archaeologists alike. Okay, so this guy, Heinrich Schliemann, he's super important to the story of finding Troy. He was from Germany, a businessman, but he loved archaeology. He really wanted to prove that the stories about Troy were true. So in 1870, he took a copy of the Iliad and went to Turkey to a place called Hisarlik. It's a big hill made of old buried cities. Now, the way Schliemann dug, it wasn't very careful. He just wanted to find treasure, so he kind of messed some things up. But he found some amazing things. He found not 1 but 9 cities, all on top of each other. That showed everyone how long and complicated the history of Troy really was. One thing he found was a golden mask, and he said it was the mask of Agamemnon, the king from the stories. Later, scientists figured out the mask was even older than Agamemnon, but it's still a really cool thing to see, like something right out of the stories. Section 4. Through the Ages, Troy 1 to 9. The story of Troy is like peeling back the layers of an ancient mythical onion. Each layer reveals a different era, a different chapter in the city's long and storied history. Okay, so these 9 layers of Troy, each one is like a different chapter in the city's story. Imagine a book where each chapter is built on top of the last one, each telling a unique part of the tale. Troy 1, the very first one, is super old, like 3000 BC. This was the dawn of the city, a time when the world was just beginning to see the rise of complex societies. It was a tiny village, just a few hundred people living in simple houses. These early inhabitants laid the foundation for what would become one of the most famous cities in history. But it grew, and by the Middle Bronze Age, Troy was a walled town with a palace and lots of trading. This period saw the city expand its influence and become a significant player in the region. Troy VI, that's from the late Bronze Age, and that's when Troy was at its best. The city was a bustling hub of activity, with impressive fortifications and a thriving economy. This is the Troy from the stories with Priam and Hector. The legends of the Trojan War, immortalized by Homer, are set in this era, making it the most famous period in Troy's history. It was a rich and powerful city, with huge walls, big gates, and a fancy citadel where the important people lived. The grandeur of Troy VI is evident in the archaeological remains that have been uncovered. Troy was rich because it was in such a good spot for trade. Its strategic location allowed it to control key trade routes, bringing wealth and prosperity to the city. Troy VII, the one from the Trojan wartime, shows signs of fire and fighting. The evidence of destruction suggests a violent end to this chapter of Troy's history. We don't know exactly what happened, but Troy was definitely in the middle of a big fight between the Greeks and another powerful group, the Hittites. The clash of these ancient titans left a lasting mark on the city. After Troy VII was destroyed, they rebuilt the city, but it was never as amazing as it was before. The subsequent layers of Troy tell a story of resilience and rebuilding, but also of a city that never quite regained its former glory. Section 5. Echoes of War Stories and Archaeology. The Trojan War from the Iliad is a famous story about love, betrayal, and big battles. It's about Helen, the Queen of Sparta, being taken by Paris, a prince of Troy. That started a huge war between the Greeks and the Trojans, a war that lasted 10 years and ended with Troy being destroyed. The Iliad is a story, but some parts might be true. We know Troy Zatha was burned down around 1300 or 1200 BC, which is around the time the Trojan War supposedly happened. Also, some really old writings talk about a city called Wilusa, which might be Troy. These writings talk about fighting between the Hittites and the Ahiyawa, who might be the Greeks. It's not totally clear, but it looks like the Trojan War story might be based on real things that happened. Section 6. The Last Trojans. A look into the past. In 2024, archaeologists found something really sad at Troy, the skeletons of 4 people, called the Last Trojans. These skeletons were from the very end of Troy, and they show us what happened to people when the city was destroyed. They found a mother and her baby. Their skeletons were close together, like they were hugging. There were also 2 young men, and their bones showed signs of fighting. This is a really sad reminder that behind all the stories and battles, real people lived and died at Troy. Finding the last Trojans has made people even more interested in what happened at the very end of Troy. Scientists are still studying the skeletons and the things found around them, and maybe we'll learn even more about these people and what happened during that important time in Troy's history.